In Chapter 1, we learned the basic terminology of things like politics, institutions, and governments. And I cautioned you not to view politics and the course as the same thing. I urged you to recognize that although we will discuss politics in terms of American government is really more than politics. We learned the primary forms of government, which were totalitarianism, authoritarianism, aristocracy, theocracy, oligarchy, and democracy. And we also learned the difference between a direct democracy and a democratic republic or a representative democracy. We also learned a little bit about political socialization, which we will learn more about in the coming weeks. We talked a little bit about this trade-off between liberty and security, between order and chaos. We talked about how to ensure that we have freedom while we remain safe. And we will continue to dig more into those concepts in the coming weeks. Importantly, near the end of the last chapter, we talked about political ideology as a continuum from socialism to libertarianism. And in the lesson this week, the readings, we're going to dig more into the Constitution and its origins. We will learn a little bit more about the development of the Constitution, the goals and objectives of the framers, and we'll learn a little bit about the initial governing documents of the United States. So our learning outcomes are to explain the colonial experience, explain how the colonial experience prepared Americans for independence, the restrictions that Great Britain placed on the colonies, and the American response to those restrictions. Now, if you've taken American History 1, much of this will sound familiar, but in this course, we will look at it more from a policy and governing perspective rather than the human perspective. We will also describe the significance of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, as well as the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. We will discuss the most important compromises reached at the Constitutional Convention and the basic structure of the resulting government. We will summarize the arguments in favor of and the arguments against adopting the Constitution and explain why the Bill of Rights was adopted. And then finally, we will describe the process for amending the Constitution and the informal ways in which constitutional interpretation has changed over time. Now, in American History 1, we actually start much earlier in time than this course picks up. But we are approaching American government from the perspective of a time in which there was some form of governing body here in the United States. Now, we're going to pick up with Jamestown. And the U.S. Constitution truly is a remarkable document. It's pretty short, it has broad principles, it's very difficult to amend, and it's really remained largely intact since it was originally written. Its context is important as both political culture and political experience of the framers are reflected in its provisions. In 1607, the English government sent a group to establish a trading post at Jamestown in what is now Virginia. This becomes the first colony. Now, the king gave the backers, quote, full power and authority, end quote. to make laws. So the king largely sent these representatives here to what becomes the United States, to what at the time was a just a tract of land in Virginia, and really gave them the ability to act as agents of the king. The colonists set up a representative assembly, which was a legislature made up of individuals representing the population. Now, it certainly wasn't wholly representative because there were certainly people who were not represented in the new government. However, it was very different from the way government looked in England. Separatists, the Mayflower, and the Compact. So the first New England colony was established in 1620 when its people were very dissatisfied with the church. Those people were called separatists. They were frustrated with the Church of England, and they sailed on the Mayflower seeking a place where they could practice their own religious beliefs. And they landed at Plymouth, which is now Massachusetts, and created what was their Mayflower Compact. And it acted as a form of public authority for those who were about to leave the ship and go ashore. Now, the compact was not a constitution, but a political statement setting forth the idea of consent of the affected individuals. So essentially, what these separatists agreed to before they ever left the Mayflower was that they were giving consent as free people to be governed in a certain way. Now, although these Plymouth settlers, called Pilgrims, committed themselves to self-government, their political ideas were different from those that we embrace today, and were even different from those that were around when the Constitution was written. They formed a religious colony with no attempt to separate the church from the government or church from state. Now, here we see, this is just an image of these pilgrims on the Mayflower, and the question that we've discussed was the Mayflower Compact an actual constitution? And the short answer is no, because it's just acknowledging that they give consent. It doesn't really set out a long list of how people will be governed. It just acknowledges that they are giving consent to be governed. By 1732, 13 colonies had been established. Though technically they were governed by London, the colonists made their own decisions and laws, developing a limited government. Legislation in the colonies like Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania gave the colonists political experience and led to the quick establishment of their own state constitutions after 1776 when the U.S. Constitution is drafted. Now, these colonists in 1732 are really certainly being ruled by London and consider themselves to be loyal subjects to the crown, but they are operating really independently and largely outside of the direct supervision or involvement of the crown. Now, this is completely fine initially because the colonies are relatively minuscule to the crown. They're not really generating a lot of income. They're really not causing any problems. They are just far away on the other side of the ocean. However, as time goes on and these colonists become more involved and the colonies become more productive and profitable, Great Britain becomes very interested in what's going on here in the colonies. Now, by the 1760s, the British Parliament had begun to pass laws that treated the colonies as a unit, and they did this largely to pay off military debt from the French and Indian War, which was waged between 1756 and 1763. Now, Parliament passes a series of taxes or acts. First, they passed the Sugar Act in 1764, and this is just as you would think, a tax on sugar. The next year in 1765 passed the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act is really a tax on any kind of exchange where money or paper might be involved. And there are a whole host of different things that are taxed in this regard. And what this did was really disrupt the daily lives of the colonists. And as it's disrupting their daily lives, they begin to feel frustrated. And they call the Stamp Act, quote, taxation without representation. And that's a very important phrase, taxation without representation. And this leads them to boycott English products, and 2 years later to stage the Boston Tea Party protest. Now, Congress in 1774 had passed a series of coercive acts, and one of the caveats in that was that it closed the Boston Harbor and took over control of any kind of shipping products that would be moved in and out of Massachusetts. And this really frustrated the colonists. This was the proverbial straw, if you will, that broke the camel's back. Now, the colonists decided that they needed to have a gathering, and a gathering is a congress. It's when we get together and we have a colonial discussion. And they decided to do this in Philadelphia. And they wanted delegates from all colonies. They wanted all of the colonies to be represented at this particular gathering or this particular Congress. Now, the First Continental Congress meets in 1774, right when those coercive acts are passed. And the focus of this gathering was not to claim independence. Independence is not something that the colonists are really thinking about in 1774. What they want to do is get together and decide collectively as these 13 colonies what their grievances are with the king and how they are being ruled. And they want to petition the king with this list of grievances because they feel that they have the right to approach the king with a list of concerns. Now, this isn't even a right that most British subjects in Britain would have. So the colonists have already begun to view themselves as very different from their neighbors in Great Britain who are also subjects of the crown. The First Continental Congress also wanted to discuss a way in which they could raise troops. They wanted to be able to call up young men to resist the British military that was coming into these ports and these major city centers and keep them from disrupting trade and commerce here in the colonies on behalf of the king. And then finally, they wanted to decide how they could boycott British trade. So they did not want to be able to be forced to purchase anything from Great Britain. Now, they've already been, for about 10 or 15 years, kind of circumventing British taxes and British laws, but they want to be even more bold with this because they feel that they have no representation in Great Britain. Now, the Crown, when they receive this sort of list of grievances, these things that are frustrating and causing mayhem to the colonists, the Crown condemns all of this, these grievances, raising troops, and the boycotts, as acts of rebellion. And so, with these acts of rebellion, the king basically issues sort of a stern talking to at this point and says this is not okay. And he will respond by sending British troops to the colonies to put down any kind of rebellion, to ensure that taxes are collected, that duties are paid. Now, the Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, just a year later, and by the time they are meeting, the fighting in what becomes the Revolutionary War had already begun. And the British and the colonists are fighting relatively heavily at this point, even though most of the colonists early on believe that this will be over very quickly. They believe that the king will give in to their demands, and they believe that they will continue to be part of the British Empire. The main focus of the Second Continental Congress was to establish an army and to declare George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of this army. Now, again, most of these colonists still truly believe that we as colonists here in the United States can be reunited and we can achieve peace with Great Britain. But the war has already begun, and it's at a point where peace must be achieved very quickly, or we will reach a point where we can't turn back. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, reflected the popular opinion in plain language, and this really rallied the colonists to begin to form their own government. Now, Thomas Paine is arguing somewhat early that it is vital that we seek independence and that we be separated from Great Britain, that we are already different in the way we live our lives, the way we conduct our business, and the way we are governed here in the colonies. And the natural progression is that we would separate completely. Now, you are probably familiar with the Minutemen, who were members of the colonial militia, and they were absolutely ready to fight the British at a moment's notice. And a question to start thinking about is, why did the Continental Congress later turn the militia into an army? And there are a lot of different reasons for that, which are outlined in your text. Now, in April of 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted for trade policies that implied that they were completely independent from Great Britain. Remember, as subjects of the crown, they would need to get permission from the king to enter into any kind of trade agreement with any other part of the world. But the colonists viewed themselves as a separate people. And so they begin to try to form state governments. They begin to advocate for trade policies independent of Great Britain. In July, the colonists declared themselves to be independent. In June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson began writing drafts of a brief precursor to the Declaration of Independence, and the Resolution of Independence was adopted on July 2nd. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, which was Jefferson's version, was amended to gain unanimous acceptance and signed on that day. Or I should say, passed on that day. On July 19th, a modified version was drafted and then signed by all members on August 2nd. Now, when Jefferson is drafting this declaration, he recognizes that there has to be complete support from all of the colonies. We couldn't have one or two colonies that were willing to hold out, because that would be an inroad for the British. And so as he is drafting this declaration, he wants to be sure that the language appeals to all of the colonies and the various state governments in these colonies. Now, the text clearly illustrates why this is one of the world's most significant documents. And it opens by saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Now, we know today that certainly people were excluded from that, but the act of writing that all men were created equal was very provocative in 1776, in a time when equality was connected to your status at birth. At the time, it was a revolutionary idea that people would have natural rights or unalienable rights. And those rights included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to live your life free and to chart your own path to happiness, to not have a government force deciding how you would live your life. This was inherent in natural law and didn't depend on any form of government. Jefferson had reflected the arguments of English philosopher John Locke, who wrote that all people possess certain natural rights, and the rights that Locke outlined were life, liberty, and property, the ability of a person to own property. Locke also argued for what he called a social contract, which was a voluntary agreement among individuals to secure their rights and welfare by creating a government and abiding by the rules of the government that they created. Very much like the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence was based on the idea of the consent of the governed, that people give their consent to be ruled, and that the government had a responsibility to protect the rights of the people. But further, Locke also believed, as did the framers, that if the government failed to protect the rights of the people not only had a right, but a duty to revolt. So again, this idea of universal truth, that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, rooted in John Locke's idea that all people have the right to life, liberty, and property, are very much at the forefront of the framers' minds, as well as the minds of those who are drafting this Declaration of Independence, drafting these first documents, and really going out and speaking to raise awareness and passion for this declaration and for independence. Now, Americans may recognize the opening words, but few questioned their link to independence. Abraham Lincoln admitted that they had no practical value in separating from Great Britain, but were included for future reference. Now, saying we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness had nothing to do with separating from Britain. We could have still had those rights as subjects of the crown. But in including that language, what the framers were ultimately saying was, if or when we win this conflict and Great Britain, again, still many Americans or many colonists still believing that we would still be subjects of the crown, that we as colonists here in what becomes the United States would have certain rights because they were given to us at birth by virtue of being born. So they were really looking for something beyond getting rid of these taxes or getting representation in Parliament and going back to business as usual. The Declaration established the legitimacy of the new nation and the legitimacy of the American Revolution. The people in the United States or in the colonies are starting to view themselves again as different from their English counterparts who are also subjects of the royal crown, whether in Great Britain or some other colonial holding of Great Britain. Additionally and importantly, because the United States or the colonies are starting to see themselves as different, they are setting themselves up as a legitimate government separate from Great Britain that can engage in trade and commerce with foreign nations. Though the colonists had formally declared independence, the war continued until Cornwallis surrendered in 1781. Britain waited until 1783 to acknowledge the independence of the colonies, and they acknowledged this in what was called the Treaty of Paris. Meanwhile, Republicans became a major political force, opposing rule by any central authority, and each state began to adopt its own constitution. They pushed for increased power to the state legislatures and essentially the politics of 1776. Two states, Georgia and Pennsylvania, adopted unicameral legislatures, which were completely unchecked by any executive or judicial authority. Now, a legislature is the people who are elected to serve the people of that individual state. And in Georgia and Pennsylvania, these legislatures operated without any executive, so without any governor, and also without any judicial authority. So they controlled the states, they really wielded all power in those states. Some states had bicameral legislatures where they had a House and a Senate, and other states had governors that might be equal in power and influence to the legislatures of the state. Some states had legislatures that were more powerful and less powerful than the governor, but the majority of those early states believed that power should not be concentrated in the hands of one person, in the hands of an executive. Now, back in June in 1776, the dominant fear or concern of all of the colonists was that there would be a too powerful government, and this fear led the Second Continental Congress to draft the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, or the Articles of Confederation. Now, a confederation is a voluntary association of independent states which retain ultimate authority except for the very limited power that they actually give to a central government. So, through the duration of the Revolutionary War, the states were viewed as separate entities from a national government. And this made the waging of the war difficult. But the dominant fear of those at the Second Continental Congress was that if states gave too much authority to this central governing force, that they would not be able to get that authority back and they would ultimately lose their sovereignty as individual states. The Articles were implemented with the final draft in 1777, but it wasn't even completely ratified until 1781, which, as you recall, is around the time that Cornwallis surrendered. The 13 states established a new government, and that government was called the Congress of the Confederation. It was a unicameral assembly with each state possessing one vote and Congress having the power to choose a president and appoint an executive committee. Now, there were a number of other powers that we'll discuss in just a moment, as well as a lack of powers. Now, again, each state has one representative in this unicameral legislature, and that one representative is appointed and elected by the individual states' legislatures. Now, certain states gave up various land claims in the West. Particularly, the Northwest Ordinance set up a pattern of government for new territories. For the first time, American resources were pooled by the American states. So, in order to get these articles accomplished, what people wanted to do was to ensure that all of the states were starting out somewhat on equal footing. Some states had been granted land in the West. Some states had purchased land in the West. And in order to ensure that all of the states were sort of starting out equal and with no debt, they gave up some of those land holdings. Now, that was a significant accomplishment because remember, this is a time when the states are accustomed to having autonomy over themselves. But there were some weaknesses, and the first weakness, the biggest weakness, was that Congress could not demand any revenues from the states. So they couldn't require any taxes to be paid by the states to effectively wage war against the British Army. The actions required the consent of the states, and only a league of friendship existed. This relied on the goodwill of the states. So ultimately, if the states felt that they could afford to raise taxes, then they would raise taxes. If they didn't feel like they could, they would not. There wasn't any central authority and there was no national system of courts. Most important, the biggest concern here was that there was no way for the central government to raise funds for a militia. So throughout the Revolutionary War, the militiamen who were fighting the British were really representing their own state. They weren't necessarily representing the Articles or the Congress, the American Congress. And this makes things difficult because there is an issue of how people are paid, when they're paid, if they're paid, their terms of service, their length of service, and so on. Now, there was a uprising called Shays' Rebellion, and this was a band of armed farmers. And they convinced the political leaders that the central government under the Articles was incapable of maintaining order or public welfare. And as a result of that, the solution really became either a stronger central government or the states have to operate completely independent of any unity or any united government. And if the latter is the case, then there's no way for states to protect themselves from a weaker state who might allow Great Britain to send troops in and take over. And as a result, Shays Rebellion really illustrates the need to revise the Articles to create a stronger, more powerful central government. In the next lesson, we will discuss the drafting of the Constitution.